Good
Okay.
afternoon, everyone. My name is Molly McBride. I'm an administrative law judge with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. In a minute, we're going to begin our hearing. I just wanted to let everyone know that we were just contacted in the last half hour by our Spanish interpreter informing us that they would not be able to attend today's hearing. I apologize for this last minute change, and we will arrange to have interpreters at future hearings. We will update our website with the information for the additional hearings where we will have Spanish interpreters available. We do have closed captioning available in Spanish translation for those of you who would like to use that option. If you've attended by the internet, you will see a small CC box on the lower left side of your screen. If you click on that, you will have the option to use the closed captioning. I would now like to introduce the DEC Commissioner Basil Sagos to welcome you today.
Thank you, Molly, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll just say a few quick remarks right off the top, and then, of course, today is all about you and your opportunity to weigh in on the really important criteria that we have in front of us. Again, I'm Basil Sagos, DEC Commissioner. I'm also the co-chair of the state's Climate Action Council, along with NYSERDA President and CEO Doreen Harris. As you probably know, New York has one of the most, if not the most, ambitious climate laws in the nation. And a heart of that, or the heart of that law, in many respects, is the consideration that it pays toward climate justice, environmental justice, and righting the wrong, not just righting the wrongs of the past, but also helping us to direct our investments to fix problems within communities that are so-called disadvantaged, which is an important definition that we're all dealing with now. That climate law, we prepared a scoping plan for it, which we delivered, draft scoping plan, on December 31st. We just completed 11 public hearings on that. The public comment period on that, separate from this one, ends on June 10th. So if you haven't already taken a look at that document, I would encourage you to at climate.ny.gov, and please submit your comments on that. But today, of course, and for the next several weeks, we are talking about the criteria related to the disadvantaged communities definition. And that's really important because that helps us to understand where we need to make investments, where we need to direct benefits, and what communities across the state need to receive, in particular, this attention that is in the heart of this climate law. So we want your input today on that. I want to thank the Climate Justice Working Group. You have several members of the Climate Justice Working Group that dedicated literally months, and in some cases, many more months, a couple of years, to come up with this definition and the work behind it, and all the staff that have worked on it between DEC and NYSERDA, some of whom are on the call today. I want to thank them for all the work that they have done. We are on the leading edge of this nationally. I want to make sure everyone understands that this is uncharted territory. So it's really important that we talk to you, that we hear from you, and then ultimately we strengthen what we've already put out there for the public. So again, I don't want to take more time. I want this to be about you today. Thank you for joining us, and let's have a robust discussion today. Back to you, Molly.
Thank you, Commissioner. Okay, we're now going to begin our hearing. On behalf of the DEC and NYSERDA, I would like to thank you for joining us here this afternoon and for participating in this very important process. The DEC, in partnership with NYSERDA, is holding 11 public hearings across New York State to receive public input on the draft disadvantaged communities criteria and to advance the finalization of the criteria to help guide the implementation of the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. New York's Climate Justice Working Group, which consists of representatives from environmental groups across the state, and New York State agency representatives, voted in December to release the draft criteria for identifying disadvantaged communities for public review. The draft disadvantaged communities criteria public comment period commenced in March with a 120-day public comment period that ends on July 7th, 2022. The draft disadvantaged communities criteria can be found at climate.ny.gov. Again, that website is climate.ny.gov. The criteria are based on geographic, public health, environmental hazard, and socioeconomic factors, and once approved, will be used to help meet the directives of the Climate Act related to reducing pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as to inform regulatory impact statements and the state's clean energy and efficiency investments. Notice of this hearing was published in the Environmental Notice Bulletin on May 4th, 2022. Assisting us today with this hearing are members of the department's Office of Communication Services, and we thank them for their help here today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Alana Kidal-Tucky, who is the director of the DEC's Office of Environmental Justice. Alana will give a brief overview of the work to date and the draft criteria. The purpose of today's public comment hearing is to allow members of the public to comment on the draft disadvantaged communities criteria. Today is not a question and answer session. Comments will be accepted at this hearing this afternoon and at 4 in-person public hearings, as well as 5 more virtual public comment hearing sessions. In a moment, I will list the dates and times for the remaining hearings. For those of you who are attending by the internet, the information will be on the screen. Written comments will be accepted until July 7th, 2022, and equal weight is given to written or oral comments. Comments submitted by email must be received by 5 p.m. on July 7th, 2022 to be considered, and comments submitted by mail must be postmarked by July 7th. Again, equal weight is given to written and oral comments. In a moment, I will read off the email address as well as the mailing address for those of you who have joined us today by telephone. The addresses will be posted on our screen in the slides. Due to the number of people who wish to speak, we are going to limit each speaker to 2 minutes to make their comments. Please be respectful of that time limit. If you have not completed your remarks after 2 minutes, we will ask you to conclude your remarks. Anyone who wishes to speak was asked to register to speak here today, and we will call registered speakers in the order in which you have registered. We will call your name when it is your turn to speak. At that time, your line will be unmuted. If you have attended over the internet, we will unmute your line and you will hear a beep on your end. If you have attended by phone, when we call your name, would you please press *3 on your phone to raise your hand, and then we will know to unmute your phone line. Again, that will be press *3 on your telephone when you hear your name called. Please do not press *3 until we have called your name. When you make your comments, please begin with your name and your address. And if you're speaking on behalf of a group, please identify the group who you represent here today. Again, if anyone is speaking here on behalf of a group or an individual, please identify who you're representing. If anyone is having a technical issue at any point during the hearing, you may call area code 518-402-8044. Again, that number is area code 518-402-8044. When you make your statement, we would ask that you please speak loudly, slowly, and clearly. All comments are being recorded by our court stenographer. If we cannot hear you, there is a risk that your statement will not be recorded accurately. Before we begin the public comment, I'd like to introduce Alana Kidal-Tucky from the DEC's Office of Environmental Justice to give a brief presentation. Alana?
Thank you, Molly. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alana Kidal-Tucky, and I am the Director of the Office of Environmental Justice at the Department of Environmental Conservation. I am also the Chair of the state's Climate Justice Working Group. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for this public hearing on the draft Disadvantaged Communities criteria. As Basil mentioned earlier, the Climate Act is the nation's most ambitious climate change-related legislation. Its goal is to reduce New York State's greenhouse gas emissions from all human activities by 100% over 1990 levels by the year 2050, with an incremental target of at least 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by the year 2030. At least 85% of the reductions by 2050 must come from preventing the release of greenhouse gases. The remaining 15 may come from carbon removal projects like soil conservation, growing forests, and restoring wetlands. Implementing the Climate Act will create opportunities to build a better future and ensure this work also advances climate justice. The Climate Act mandates at least 35 to 40% of the benefits of New York State spending on clean energy accrue in disadvantaged communities. State agencies are also required to prioritize greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities. This includes DEC in the drafting of regulations to meet the greenhouse gas emissions limits that are required by the Climate Act. The identification and prioritization of disadvantaged communities in accounting of the benefits of cutting pollution and improving resilience is what makes our Climate Act a transformative law. To identify disadvantaged communities in New York, the Climate Justice Working Group was guided by the language of the Climate Act in identifying disproportionately burdened communities. They voted to include 45 indicators using data and environmental hazards, climate change risks, public health issues, geography, and socioeconomic factors like race, income, education levels, unemployment rates, and housing conditions. Additionally, the draft disadvantaged communities designations are reflective of the working group, their lived experiences, and the lived experiences of the residents of these historically overburdened and underfunded communities. Each census tract is scored based on a relative burden, risk, vulnerability, or sensitivity. Specifically, the percentile rates of the indicators for each census tract are combined to produce a value that measures a census tract's relative level of environmental burden and climate change risks, as well as population characteristics and health vulnerabilities relative to other tracts. Tracts with higher scores relative to other tracts in the state or in their region were identified as disadvantaged communities. The working group also voted to include low-income households with incomes at 60% of the state median income as disadvantaged for the purposes of benefits and investments. On the screen, you'll see that it will come up again. There'll be a snapshot of what the disadvantaged communities criteria looks like on the map of the New York City area. 59% of the tracts in New York City are considered as geographic DACs under the draft criteria. Thank you again. Thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing your comments, and please continue. Molly?
Alana. So we're going to begin with our public comments here now. Again, we will call your name when it is your turn to speak. If you have not joined us by the internet and are on the telephone, we will ask you to press *3 when we call your name, but please wait until we call your name, okay? Our first speaker today is Sonia Chung.
Hold on,
Ms.
Molly.
Chung? Go ahead, Ms. Chung. Ms. Chung, you've been unmuted. Oh, I believe she might still be muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Sonia Chung, and I am a staff attorney in the Environmental Justice Program at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. NILPI's Environmental Justice Program partners with communities to fight against environmental racism in New York. Thank you to New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and New York State Energy Research and Development Authority for the opportunity to testify in support of the Climate Justice Working Group's draft Disadvantaged Communities criteria. We thank the members of the Climate Justice Working Group for their tireless work in developing the draft criteria. NILPI enthusiastically supports the just, thorough, and data-driven draft criteria developed by the working group. NILPI also supports the selection of indicators used by the Climate Justice Working Group and supports including low-income households for the purpose of directing clean energy and energy efficiency investments. Importantly, we stand by the Climate Justice Working Group's acknowledgement that climate change does not affect all New Yorkers equally, and more specifically, that climate change disproportionately impacts Black, Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous communities. The use of race and ethnicity as a factor in identifying disadvantaged communities is critical, as legacies of historical discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity result in minority populations bearing the harshest impacts from climate change. New York State's draft criteria will, unlike the federal government's equivalent, face the issues and their roots clearly for what they are. The efforts to repair decades of environmental racism must begin with the common sense truth that racism has to do with race. Such use of race-based factors is constitutional. Equal protection challenges to using racial classifications undergo a strict scrutiny standard in the courts, and under that standard, the use of race is constitutional if it is found to be a narrowly tailored measure that furthers a compelling governmental interest. New York has a well-documented past of racial discrimination, and as is evident in the CLCPA, and is the heart of the law, as Commissioner Sagos aptly described it, a compelling interest in remedying the effects of it. The Supreme Court has held that remedying the effects of past intentional discrimination is a compelling interest under the strict scrutiny test. Race-neutral alternatives to identifying disadvantaged communities would not directly address the environmental racism that the CLCPA seeks to address, which specifically targeted communities based on their race. In conclusion, we urge DEC and NYSERDA to finalize the criteria as drafted by the Climate Justice Working Group, and we call for swift implementation of that draft criteria so New York State may properly carry out the mandates of the CLCPA. The Climate Justice Working Group's draft criteria is how New York State can make sure that those communities are prioritized and centered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chung. Our next speaker is David Heppenstall. David Heppenstall. Could we unmute Mr. Heppenstall's line, please?
We are trying to do that. And WebEx is, let's see. What just happened? Okay, we are not able to unmute Mr. Heppenstall right at this time. We might have to come back. Unless, okay.
Now
you are
unmuted.
Yes, you are unmuted. Yep.
Thank you.
Heppenstall, I apologize for the delay, but go ahead.
Yeah, I do not have formal comments at this time. Okay, I would like to defer my formal comments, but I just want to repeat my full support for everything that has just been stated. She said it very well, and I agree with everything she said. I do want to supplement my comments in writing.
Thank you very much. The email address and the mailing address will be on the screen, and I will read them at the end of the public comments for anyone who's joined us by phone. Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Heppenstall. Our next speaker is Mary Arnold, and I see that we have someone who signed in just by the first name Mary. So if we could unmute that line to see if that's Miss Arnold, and if not, then we'll go to our telephone lines. But let's right now unmute the internet, sign in with the first name Mary. Go ahead. Is this Miss Arnold?
Yes, yes, it is. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment.
You can continue.
Yes. Today, freight rail in New York State creates pollution hotspots. Legacy freight fleet locomotives are not a low emission mode. These are locomotives from the 1970s that were left out of the Clean Air Act. Families buy freight rail yards from Stillwater and Mechanicville to Fresh Pond Yard in Queens are being harmed by needless pollution because railroads have failed to modernize their fleets to Tier 4 emission standards, and also because the railroads are hauling unenclosed waste that emits spillage, blow-off, leachate, and odors. The California Air Resources Board has studied pollution from rail yards, determined there are harms, and has developed strategies and taken actions to address harms. Although some communities by rail yards are designated disadvantaged under the draft criteria, others are not. New York State must specifically include rail yards and also adjacent tracks in neighborhoods where yard operations take place daily as a factor in determining a disadvantaged community, and also modify the scope of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to include strategies modeled after the California Air Resources Boards and on Tier 4 repowering that has already taken place by the Port Authority, New York, New Jersey, and waste management that eliminates 95% of that pollution. The scope is terribly out of date in this regard. It's looking forward to hydrogen powered locomotives, which are 15 years in the future, if at all. So in both regards, please take action. And I thank you very much for finally addressing the inequities that have been so burdensome to particular communities. Thank you very much for that. And also to the legislature for passing these laws and for the recent environmental justice laws to address cumulative impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Arnold. Our next speaker is Ricardo Lopez, who I believe may be attending by telephone. So Mr. Lopez, if you have joined us today by telephone, I would ask you to press *3 on your phone to raise your hand, and then we'll know to unmute your line. So we're looking for Ricardo Lopez. If you have joined us today by telephone, please press *3 on your phone, and we will unmute your line for you to make your comment. Ricardo Lopez. And right now, it does not appear that anyone has raised their hand. I'll go back to Mr. Lopez again. Our next speaker is Lori Schumann. Lori Schumann. And I do not see Ms. Schumann on our list of attendees. So Ms. Schumann, if you have joined us by telephone today, I would ask that you please press *3 on your telephone, and we will know to unmute your line. Lori Schumann. If you've joined us today by phone, please press *3 on your phone, and we will unmute your line for you to make your comment. And at this time, I do not have anyone who has raised their hand. I'm going to call Mr. Lopez again in case he has just joined us. Ricardo Lopez, if you have joined us today by telephone or signed in under a different name, we would ask that you please raise your hand. If you've joined us by telephone, please press *3 on your phone to raise your hand, and we will know to unmute your line. If you've joined us by the internet and have signed in under another name, there's a small hand icon on the bottom of your screen. Just click on that, and we'll know to unmute your line. Either Ricardo Lopez or Lori Schumann. Okay, I do not have any raised hands at this time. At this point, I would like to welcome comments from anyone who was not able to register before today's hearing. If anyone who's in attendance would like to make a comment here today, then I would ask that you please raise your hand, and we will unmute your line one by one to take your comments. If you've joined us over the internet, you will see on the bottom of your screen a small hand. If we could put that slide up for a minute to show people how they can raise their hand to make a comment, that would be great. There's a small hand icon on the bottom of your screen, and if you click on that, you can raise your hand, and we will know to unmute your line to allow you to make a comment. If you've joined us by telephone and you would like to make a comment, please press *3 on your telephone, and we will unmute your line. In the meantime, while we're waiting for anyone who would like to make a comment, I'm going to read off the dates and locations for the remaining hearings. We have an in-person hearing tomorrow in Poughkeepsie. Tomorrow, Thursday, May 26th at 6 p.m. We have an in-person hearing for the public to comment on the draft criteria. The location of the hearing is the Beulah Baptist Church, 92 Catherine Street, Poughkeepsie, New York. Again, that's 6 p.m. tomorrow at the Beulah Baptist Church, 92 Catherine Street, Poughkeepsie, New York. We have our next virtual hearing on Thursday, June 2nd at 6 p.m. Thursday, June 2nd, 6 p.m. will be a virtual hearing for the Finger Lakes Southern Tier regions. Our next in-person hearing after tomorrow's hearing is Friday, June 10th at 6 p.m. at the Grace Baptist Church at 52 South 6th Avenue in Mount Vernon. And that is for the Lower Hudson Valley region. And again, that is at the Grace Baptist Church, 52 South 6th Avenue, Mount Vernon. And that's on Friday, June 10th at 6 p.m. We then have another in-person hearing at the DEC's Region 2 office, which is located at 4740 21st Street. The hearing room is on the 8th floor at Long Island City, and that hearing will be on Tuesday, June 14th at 6 p.m. Tuesday, June 14th, 6 p.m. at the DEC's Region 2 office at 47-40 21st Street on the 8th floor at Long Island City. We have another virtual hearing for the Central New York Mohawk Valley region, and that will be on Wednesday, June 15th at 6 p.m. Another virtual hearing, Wednesday, June 15th at 6 p.m. We have a virtual hearing for the North Country Capital Region members on Tuesday, June 21st at 12 p.m. Tuesday, June 21st, 12 p.m., a virtual hearing for North Country and Capital Region communities. Then on Thursday, June 23rd at 6 p.m. for the Western New York region, there will be a hearing at Push, P-U-S-H, Push Buffalo, which is the former School 77 at 429 Plymouth Avenue, Buffalo, New York. And again, that hearing is on Thursday, June 23rd at 6 p.m. That's an in-person hearing. We have a virtual hearing on Wednesday, June 29th at 12 p.m. for the Hudson Valley community. Wednesday, June 29th, 12 p.m. for the Hudson Valley community. That will also be virtual. And we have our final virtual hearing on Thursday, June 30th at 12 p.m. for the Western New York area. That's a virtual hearing for the Western New York community on Thursday, June 30th at 12 p.m. If you would like to attend any of those hearings in person or virtually, the details for attending are on the DEC website, on the climate website. It's climate.ny.gov, climate.ny.gov. If you see the link for the disadvantaged communities criteria, the details are there. We also have the details available on the DEC website. If you go to dec.ny.gov, on our homepage, in the middle of the page is the DEC calendar. On today's date, there will be a link for the information for the hearings. You can click on today's date for the information and all the details will be there. I will note that I don't have any raised hands right now, but in the meantime, I'm going to read off the addresses for submission of written comments. If you would like to submit your comments by email, the email address for the submission of comments is dacomments@dec.ny.gov. That's DAC comments, DAC@dec.ny.gov. And the mailing address for the submission of comments is draft DAC comments to the New York State DEC, Attention Office of Environmental Justice, 625 Broadway, 14th floor, Albany, New York, 12233. Again, comments must be submitted by July 7th, 2022. And both the mailing address and the email address are also available on the website at climate.ny.gov. So if you missed those addresses, if you've joined us by the internet, they are on our screen. As the slides advance, you will see the addresses and you can find the links for the information at climate.ny.gov. Again, if anyone has joined us that did not register to speak, would like to make a comment. If you joined us by phone, press *3 on your telephone and we will unmute your line. If you've joined us by the internet, there is a small hand icon that you can click on and that will raise your hand for us and we will unmute your line. If anyone would like to make a comment. I will note that I don't have any raised hands right now. It is 12:33, so I will take about a 5-minute break just in case anyone would like to take a few minutes and decide, and then in 5 minutes, we'll go back on the record and see if anyone would like to make a comment. So right now, we'll take a 5-minute break, and then I'll come back and ask again if anyone would like to make a comment. Thank you.
Okay, we're off the record. On the record.
Thank you. I'm going to resume the hearing, and I'm going to call the names of two people who had registered to speak that weren't online when we called them before. I'm going to call their names again. If you're here and you've joined us by phone, we'll ask you to press *3. If you're here and you've joined us by the internet, we will unmute your line, although I don't see one of our speakers. But I'm going to call the first registered speaker who we called before, Ricardo Lopez. Ricardo Lopez, if you have joined us today by the telephone, I would ask that you please press *3 on your phone, and we will unmute your line so you can make your comments. Ricardo Lopez. If you've joined us today, Mr. Lopez, by phone, please press *3. And I will note that no one has raised their hand, so I will call our next speaker, Lori Schumann, and I see that we have a speaker who is signed in as Lori. So if we could unmute that line, please. So if we could unmute the attendee, Lori, we will see. Go ahead, Ms. Schumann, is that you? The attendee who is signed in as Lori, you've been unmuted if you'd like to make a comment. The attendee who has joined us today, signed in as Lori, we unmuted your line. Okay.
She muted it as, again, Judge,
Okay.
I can try to unmute again just to see if there
Well,
was a mistake.
Go ahead.
Lori,
We
you're
have a
unmuted?
registered- Go ahead. Okay. That's probably not someone who wants to make a
Okay.
comment, but thank you. If there's anyone else who's joined us that would like to make a comment, if you've joined us by telephone, please press *3 on your phone. Otherwise, use the raised hand function.
We
On
did
the
see that
computer.
in the chat that Lori was trying to speak and the system was interfering. So she was trying to speak.
Okay, let's unmute Lori again.
Okay. Lori, you're
Lori.
unmuted.
the call-in number?
Nope,
Lori,
go right
you've
ahead.
been unmuted. Lori, you've been
Thank you.
unmuted if you'd like to make a comment.
Yes, I'm speaking. Can you hear me?
We can,
Yes,
yes,
we can
thank
hear you.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I just wanted to make a comment that in addition to the disadvantaged communities criteria statement that's been put forward, I think that it's critical, and I'm representing myself, Lori Schumann, with respect to this statement. I'm a resident of Brooklyn, New York, Prospect Heights. I work for Enterprise Community Partners. We are an affordable housing organization in New York and the nation. I'd like to note that it is important to ensure that we consider housing and shelter when we think about determining the disadvantaged and underserved communities. That disadvantaged communities also are defined by not having sufficient affordable housing so that they can live a safe and healthy lives. So I would like to put forward that you consider, as part of the disadvantaged communities concept, that affordable housing needs to be part of that discussion. We know that with rising rents and costs of housing becoming unaffordable to so many communities across the state, that this is a critical consideration and it must be taken by the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schuman. I apologize if we had some technical issues. A request was made that we put the number up again for anyone that might be having any sort of an issue. If you're having any technical issue, you can call area code 518-402-8044, 518-402-8044. And we also have the number on the screen right now for how to join this meeting, if anyone would like to join the meeting that hasn't been able to. And I don't see any additional raised hands. So I believe we have called on everyone that would like to make a comment. I will ask one last time if there's anyone that would like to make a comment while the record is open. If you're joined us by phone, please press *3 on your telephone. We will unmute your line. If you've joined us by the internet, you will see small hand icon on your screen. If you click on that, that will raise your hand and we will know to unmute your line. Okay, and I will note that we do not have any raised hands. And I will also note that in the chat that we have available, I don't have anyone that has asked to make a comment or indicated that they're having difficulty raising their hand. So at this time, on behalf of the DEC and NYSERDA, I would like to thank everyone for taking the time here today to join us in this very important project. We thank you for joining us, making your comments, and being part of this process. Again, if you want to join any of the other hearings, the details are available at climate.ny.gov, climate.ny.gov. All the details for attending any future hearings are there. The written comments will be due by July 7th. Email is daccomments, plural, daccomments@dec.ny.gov. If you would like to mail in comments, please mail them to New York State DEC, Draft DAC Comments. Attention, Office of Environmental Justice, 625 Broadway, 14th floor, Albany, New York, 12233. And both the email address and the mailing address are available at climate.ny.gov. Again, on behalf of the department and NYSERDA, I thank everyone for joining us here today and being a part of this very important process. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're off the record.